Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Iron Culture. It is me, Eric Trexler, alone, afraid and alone. It's just going to be me this episode. Helms is off doing whatever it is Helms does. Who can say? So I'm holding down the fort here. I already have extremely negative chatter in the live chat. We've got Expanda asking, where is my jazz music? That was one of the best things about the podcast being the live jazz music. I tell you what, Expanda, since you were the first person in the live chat here over on the Iron Culture YouTube channel, I'm going to commit to you. I will bring back the intro music. I've made many mistakes in my life. One of them was veering away from that music intro. I am on it. I will make it happen. Okay, so folks, as you are settling into the live chat, once again, welcome to the show. This is going to be a little bit different of an episode. What I'm going to do today is take you through a recent happening in the world of evidence-based fitness/nutrition stuff. It was a really interesting back and forth, really interesting saga, I guess you would say, that took almost 2 years to kind of happen. So I want to walk through what went down, and more importantly after that, what it kind of tells us about the state of science in the world of exercise and nutrition, and kind of what it means in terms of how we might move forward in attempt to be someone who is evidence-based. You know, there's all these content creators who make kind of quote-unquote evidence-based fitness content. A lot of people claim to be science-based lifters, or, you know, take a science-based approach to their nutrition. And I think in order for any of those to really carry any weight or mean anything, it means very seriously and rigorously engaging with the evidence and the research that exists, and also being critical of that where it's warranted, not only the research itself, but also the processes that are intended to maintain the integrity of that research. So we're going to talk about an interesting saga where basically this paper was published about apple cider vinegar as a weight loss tool. Almost immediately, it caught my eye, teamed up with a couple fantastic people I'll talk about as we go here. We wrote a letter to the editor, and the whole thing kind of snowballed from there. And just within the last week or so, that paper was actually retracted. And so we're going to talk through how that process went down, the investigation that unfolded, what the investigation found, and then again, talking big picture, what does this mean for people who regularly try to translate evidence into practice? But before we get into that, a couple things to get out of the way here. If you enjoy the show and you want to support it, there's many ways to do it. Make sure that you like, make sure that you rate, make sure you subscribe. You know all the good stuff. Leave a review if you like the show. If you don't like the show, maybe don't leave a review. Maybe skip that part. But do make sure that you're subscribed. And of course, if you want to be a massive, top-tier, ultra supporter, make sure you head over to massresearchreview.com and consider becoming a member of the Mass community. We put out a research review the first of the month. Every single month, we've been doing it since 2017. So we've got a new issue coming out in just a couple days here on October 1st, and it is a doozy. Here's my sales pitch. If you were a member of the Mass community, then you knew about this apple cider vinegar paper essentially as soon as it came out, and you probably did not take it particularly seriously, and you certainly, if you're a member of the Mass community, did not actually act upon the information in it. So if you want to be approximately 2 years ahead of the research curve, become a member of the Mass community. One other thing I want to mention, I want to give a shout out to our dear friends at Elite FTS. If you have any needs related to gear or apparel of the lifting variety, make sure you head over to elitefts.com. You can use our discount code MRR10, stands for Mass Research Review 10, to get 10% off most items in their online store. Elite FTS, if you don't know, it's Dave Tate's operation over there in Central Ohio. They have been a fixture in the iron game for a very long time, making extremely high quality products. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, I've been using stuff from Elite FTS since about, I don't even have access to the email that I would have used to look up my order confirmation. I think that I've been using their stuff since like 2010, maybe. Wrist wraps, straps, you name it. So if you're in the market for any of your lifting related stuff, bands, I'm sure they've got all sorts of knee wraps and sleeves, and you name it, I'm sure they've got it over there. So head over to elitefts.com, use the code MRR10. All right, folks, let's go ahead and dive in here. As I mentioned, it was a couple years ago almost that this paper came across my desk. It was called Apple Cider Vinegar for Weight Management in Lebanese Adolescents and Young Adults with Overweight and Obesity, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study. And this paper, in short, really caught my attention. It was published in BMJ Nutrition, Prevention, and Health. And the easiest way to summarize the findings in a nutshell is this paper came out and reported very substantial fat loss effects. Whether you're talking about the change in fat mass or the change in BMI or the change in body weight, the effects were very, very striking for a relatively short-term intervention. And basically, we crunched the numbers. And the effects of apple cider vinegar in terms of weight loss were comparable, and in some cases, depending on what trial you're looking at, better than the effects of Ozempic on weight loss. And so that's going to catch my eye 10 times out of 10. Because if you tell me that I can take 5 or 10 or 15 milliliters of apple cider vinegar a day, and that's going to give me Ozempic-like results without Ozempic-like potential side effects. Now, I'm not a person who bashes, these GLP-1 weight loss drugs. I actually think they're quite a marvel, pretty incredible. As new medications go, I've been really amazed by, what we've seen in that space in terms of the research and the clinical applications. But nonetheless, they do, of course, like any other medication, have a side effect profile. Some of those side effects, although rare, can be substantial. So if you tell me, hey, we've got this thing, it works as well, the side effects are not nearly as, even though the low probability ones are not nearly as severe. And also, if that's true, then we could, instead of having this giant, like $100 billion industry or whatever it's at these days, we can just use vinegar. So, for example, the last time I looked into the actual pricing for what it would take to be on like a GLP-1 drug, I saw various things, but over the last couple of years, depending on when you looked, it might be somewhere in the ballpark of $500 or even up to $1,000 a month. And so, basically the value proposition is, what if I gave you this apple cider vinegar, and instead of $500 to $1,000 a month, we're talking about $6 a month. I haven't priced out vinegar lately, but a fundamentally negligible cost with a lower side effect profile. Not only is that a huge game changer, if true, at the personal level, but it also essentially wipes out an enormous, what has essentially become a sub-industry of the pharmaceutical industry. So it was very surprising to me and to my colleagues that nobody was looking at this with a level of skepticism and scrutiny and saying, why are we still doing Ozempic and similar GLP-1 drugs if we are to take this seriously? And I've never gotten a good answer for that. Again, under the assumption that we're taking the findings seriously and literally. So again, we crunched the numbers, and basically what we found is, in terms of weight loss, as reported, we were looking at something that was similar, if not in some cases better than Ozempic for weight loss. And essentially there's two levers you could pull mechanistically to make that happen. One would be a reduction in energy intake that, again, rivals what we see with these potent GLP-1 drugs. The other potential mechanism was, well, maybe this is increasing energy expenditure, by far a less probable mechanism. But if so, if you actually crunch out the numbers, then essentially what we're looking at is something that is increasing energy expenditure at rest to a level that we haven't seen, since looking at DNP. And the problem with DNP is that sometimes it literally kills people if they take too much because of this dangerous increase in energy expenditure. So DNP is what they call an uncoupling agent as it pertains to proton leak within the mitochondria. And so what that means is basically it causes extra proton leakage within the mitochondria, which decouples that flux of protons from the actual process of generating ATP. So under normal circumstances, that whole process is linked, and the movement of those protons within the mitochondria ultimately facilitates the production of ATP. But if there's leakage, if there's excess leakage, then what happens is your body is kind of going through and doing metabolism. It's doing all the preliminary steps, including the stuff that actually increases thermogenesis. So as a byproduct of just doing metabolism to create ATP, our body burns calories and generates heat. But the payoff is supposed to be at the last step, we generate all this ATP to fuel body functions. And so therefore, there's this really nice feedback loop where we burn these calories, we increase this, we have this thermogenic effect where we're generating heat, but because we're creating ATP, then we stop doing so much metabolism because we say, cool, we've got all the ATP we were trying to create, now we can chill a little bit. But if you have all this extra proton leak, then you're going through all the calorie burning and the heat generation, but you're not generating as much ATP. And so therefore you do, as I'm used to talking in a cadence to inspire my students to shout out or participate, but I don't hear anyone shouting into my headphones right now. But basically, if you are doing this whole process, these protons are leaking, you're not creating all that ATP, you're going to do more metabolism. And so you're churning through even more calories, generating even more heat. And so what we find is when people take especially very high doses of DNP, there's this kind of runaway metabolism that causes this massive expenditure of calories, but more problematically, this massive increase in metabolic heat generation. And in some cases, there have been situations where that kind of runaway metabolism and heat generation has led to fatal instances of hyperthermia, even in thermoneutral conditions. So people that are just sitting in a normal temperature room who are doing metabolism at such a rate and without a functioning feedback loop such that they generate a tremendous amount of body heat and ultimately die. So that is kind of the premise of why we had the initial premise of why there was so much scrutiny and skepticism of this paper is, what are you telling me? Are you telling me that this reduces appetite on the level of Ozempic, or that it increases expenditure on the dangerous level of DNP? And also, by the way, in this study, there were, I believe, no side effects reported, or if there were, they were extremely minor in nature. So yeah, there were just things that in terms of face validity just didn't seem to make much sense. So that leads to a letter to the editor. I teamed up with Vahid Malboubi. I could be mispronouncing his name. We've emailed a million times, but I don't think we've actually chatted, or I've certainly never heard his name spoken in the course of conversation. But Vahid is the lead author. And of course, we teamed up with none other than the James Heathers, who has really carved out a bit of a niche in this space of identifying research for which there is great skepticism and ultimately shining a light on that research. In some cases, it may be warranted to follow up with an investigation. In some cases, James's work has led to retractions of papers. So James is a seasoned veteran in this pursuit of following up on papers that lead to tremendous skepticism and getting to the root of what might be causing the findings that have been observed. So we basically wrote this letter to the editor. It is published on BMJ, Nutrition, Prevention, and Health, where we talk about a variety of things. We talk about the magnitude of effects, which certainly caught our eye and raised concerns about biological plausibility in terms of identifying a mechanism that could actually make that happen and not be dangerous. We talked about some data characteristics using a procedure called Sprite that gave us some cause for concern in terms of just the way the data were reported. So we presented some graphs saying, if these data in these tables are what they say they are, then these must be some very unusual data distributions that are hiding in the actual data set. And our question was, how would the data come to be distributed that way? It would be very much statistical improbability, if not a statistical anomaly in some cases. Of course, we talked about some issues we had with the actual statistical approach that was taken. And again, at the end, kind of laid out, our concerns about if we compare these effects against things like GLP-1 drugs and DNP or 2,4-dinitrophenol, things just don't seem to be adding up here. And, the final thing that we kind of mentioned or alluded to in this letter is in the original paper, the authors basically had a data disclosure statement at the end of it that said all the data for this study have been uploaded as a supplementary file. And so when I first read this paper, I thought, cool, I'm going to dive into the supplementary file and get to the bottom of, resolving all of my concerns, skepticism, etc. If they uploaded the data, then I'll just take a look and see, why these table values look the way they do. But when you go to the supplementary file, or when you did originally, when the paper was published, it would just take you to a press release by the journal, which was basically just hyping up the paper itself. So that is not actually technically data to include a press release that just hypes up the findings. So we also included that. We said, hey, all of our concerns could be alleviated if we could just take a peek at the data, which was allegedly supposed to be made available. So if you could make that available, that would sure be terrific. And then, of course, before we wrote this, I should mention, we emailed the corresponding author of the paper multiple times asking for the data set, which, as far as we could tell, was by accident, essentially not uploaded with the original paper. And so we're just like, hey, it says it's uploaded as a supplementary file. If you could send us the data, we'd love to take a look at it. And none of our emails, we tried multiple times, none of them were eventually answered. So that led to this process of, so I'm going to go through the timeline in a bit, but let's pretend that time went in a linear fashion here. So we published the letter to the editor, and then eventually there was a response. And to be totally honest, the response to the letter annoyed me more than the original paper. So basically, they kind of went through and almost addressed some of our concerns, but not really. So for the statistical methodology, they basically defended using t-tests instead of analysis of variance with no adjustment for multiplicity, which, without getting too technical, basically that perspective lives in a world or some kind of alternate universe where we didn't decide in about the 1930s. It's been nearly 100 years since we decided that's probably not a good idea, and we should probably, at the bare minimum, do some kind of multiplicity adjustment. Of course, with this particular study, it goes beyond that. It should have also included a baseline adjustment. Some type of ANCOVA type approach or linear mixed model that has a baseline adjustment. There were a lot of opportunities to do a better approach statistically that is frankly more valid, and they just kind of said, nah. No, we're not going to do any of that. No, thank you. For the biological plausibility, they basically said there's evidence that apple cider vinegar can significantly influence body weight, fat mass, and metabolic markers such as blood glucose, insulin sensitivity, and triglyceride levels. They mentioned that the acetic acid component can enhance fat oxidation or inhibit fat synthesis by increasing mitochondrial activity. But again, none of this really makes any sense when you apply it to the kind of magnitude effect that we're talking about. So if you're talking about without impacting energy expenditure, promoting fat oxidation, well then, okay, we might see a modest increase in fat oxidation at the expense of carbohydrate or protein oxidation. But where in the world did all these calories go? That is not something that would be answered by that kind of mechanistic justification. They took issue with our use of the sprite analysis and said these kinds of reconstruction techniques, in their words, are sensitive to assumptions and should not be viewed as definitive evidence of data irregularities. In fact, data simulation models often result in variations that may not necessarily mirror the original data set, which is interesting because if we highlight like, hey, these data distributions look odd, the easiest way to rebut that type of comment is to simply plot the data distributions and say, nope, here they are. They are not odd. They are very normal. They are very typical. And so that did not happen. And so it was basically like their response was like, have you ever considered that you might be wrong, without giving any evidence to make us believe that we were wrong? Data availability, they basically said like, well, this is more of like an ethics and privacy thing, which I would be open to if the original paper didn't say, we are happy to upload our data, here it is attached to this submission. So if from the jump they basically said, hey, our university is really particular about this stuff for liability reasons, and therefore they're very particular about how, when, where, and why we make data available, I could live with that on the initial submission to the journal. But if you tell me, hey, it's just attached, make sure you download it, and then you say, no, I'm definitely not going to let you see it, to me, that's a bit of a problem. And so I think one of the things that made me really annoyed about this particular letter is like, so for example, you see here this paper by Daniel Lakens. This was just egregiously miscited. They basically cited it while making a claim that is not at all supported by the paper itself. So that to me was very annoying because it's just like, here's a statement that is not true and not in this paper, but we're going to cite this paper. The reason that gets under my skin is because it's a great paper. Like I have like a personal level, like fondness for this paper, and to see it misused in that way was particularly grating to me. And then, just making statements that don't hold water whatsoever statistically. Like, it's one thing to miscite that paper. And also, the other thing that kind of drove me nuts was we're just pretending that we don't need any kind of post hoc corrections for multiple t-tests, which again, that was old news in 1941. So unless you're going to substantially rewrite the last 9 decades of statistical literature, you kind of have to give me more than like, what if I didn't adhere to like basic best practices? So it bothered me that this letter was written, but it bothered me way more that it was accepted. And so when this was accepted, I wrote a letter, or not a letter. I wrote an email saying like, what in the world are we doing here? But I think, my light went off on me. There we go. I think my dear friend, James Heathers, wrote a very funny blog post over on his Substack. It's called jamesclaims.substack.com. And he kind of walks through how this all went down. And I love the way that he laid out the timeline. Because I said previously, like, for the time being, in the interest of just being concise, we'll pretend that time advanced in a linear way. But I can promise you this stuff all happened super out of order and in a very strange way. So as James recounts it, in May 2024, he sees this paper, and the way he said, the way he puts it, it was full of unlikely features, contradictory data, and generalized silliness. The good way to put it. So then, me and Vahid have been kind of talking about this paper. We see that he's talking about this paper. We kind of team up and decide, let's do this the right way. The right way to do this is first you email the corresponding author for the data. That is procedurally the correct thing to do. And with multiple attempts and ample time, if you never hear a response, then you write a letter to the editor and you let the journal handle it. So like I said, the paper was published in May. We sent them the letter to the editor in June, and it was published in October. Or I'm sorry, it was accepted in October. Now, in November or December of 2024, I forget which one, that was when they published their rebuttal to our letter to the editor. But major issue, our letter to the editor was not published. So basically, the journal published their response to our letter to the editor, which to readers did not exist. So they didn't cite our letter to the editor, and they were basically arguing with ghosts. They were arguing against a thing that, in the eye of the reader, did not exist and could not be accessed. So then we told the journal, like, hey, you kind of have to like publish our letter as well so people can see what's going on here. What was really crazy about it, James lays out the timeline numerically. And so basically this paper got retracted 559 days after it was published, 504 days after James first published his criticisms, 464 days after we submitted our letter to them. And what's really weird and was annoying was that at first they were going to charge us over $2,600 US to submit that letter to the editor, which I don't think people know how this works, but like with open access journals, you have to pay to publish your paper, which is a whole conversation unto itself and that I could gripe about forever. But what was particularly crazy about that was we were annoyed because this paper got published and, in our view, shouldn't have. We didn't think it received a proper and appropriate level of scrutiny in the peer review process. So now we're going through the trouble of writing, compiling this evidence, doing these analyses to inform the journal, like, hey, for your sake, to the extent you value your reputation, you should act upon this. And at first, like, I had to work really hard to get them to not charge us $2,600, $2,652 for doing what they should have done at the beginning for them, which was just extremely annoying. So I think James went back and counted, and by his count, I'll take his word for it, there were 12 emails back and forth to try to figure out whether or not we should have to pay $2,600 to correct what they had mistakenly done. James estimates that this process took approximately 100 emails in total. Zero is, by the time they retracted it, they actually didn't tell us first. They just did it. And then I think like 2 days later, I finally got an email saying, oh, by the way, thanks for sending 100 emails back and forth. We decided to retract that a few days ago. So I kind of buried the lead, but eventually at the end of the day, we submitted this original letter to the editor. There was all the shenanigans about, for some reason, it was accepted but not published. And then they responded with this letter to the ghost remnants of what our letter was. Then eventually they got our letter up. But all of this essentially, plus the emails that I sent after this rebuttal to our letter where I was like, none of these claims are appropriate and some of them are just flat wrong. Basically, none of them were sufficient and some of them were just flatly not true. Basically, what they did was initiated some kind of statistical investigation that we were not a part of. I have no idea who did that, the investigation itself. So after that investigation on the 23rd of September, they go ahead and submit this retraction. And in the supplementary material, that's where I got a few laughs because they included a supplementary file that kind of talks through how they did this. Like they did a very formal write-up, that whoever did the statistical review of what they did and what they found. And going through that, I got some serious kicks out of that, because at the end of the day, we essentially claimed in our letter, we're like, hey, these data distributions look really weird if you kind of reconstruct what they would be based on the summary data that we're seeing in these tables. And then in their rebuttal, they were just like, no, sometimes people mess up when they try to reconstruct this stuff and you're making assumptions and stuff like that. So just leave it alone. Right? This is basically what it came down to. So according to the statistical review, they looked at the results reported in table 3 of the article. This was the anthropometric outcomes, some of the key variables. And they said of the 128 values reported in table 3, none of them agreed with the supplied data set. So the researchers gave these statisticians a data set. The journal basically made them. The statisticians tried to reconstruct the tables in the paper, and they went 0 out of 128 for trying to reconstruct the values in table 3. For table 4, there were 128 values in table 4, and they went 0 out of 128 for trying to reconstruct those values. So to me, that makes it all the more rich that in the rebuttal to our letter that basically said like, hey, we have some concerns about like what these data must look like based on the summary data in these tables. Basically, the outcome is, yeah, well, that's because none of the values in the tables actually match the underlying data sheet. So it turns out that the assumption-driven reconstructions that we tried actually had some veracity, and indeed, there was more to get to the bottom of in terms of why those table values look so odd. It turns out they were not reflective of the data, which is an interesting turn of events. So I'm not going to get too much further into the weeds. All this stuff is documented. You can read about it if you like, but I think James did a great job kind of writing about how annoying this whole process was, how long it took. And the last thing that I want to highlight is one of the reasons that this matters so much. I can't really see, at one point in time, I remember checking and seeing that even though this was a fairly new paper when I checked, it was, I believe, the most read paper in the history of this journal, which means it just caught on like wildfire and was immediately kind of circulating and making the rounds. So there's something called alt metrics, which basically seeks to quantify how much a research paper gets shared, posted on the internet, commented about, things like that. And so the alt metric, basically, if an alt metric value is high, basically means this thing went viral. People saw it, people talked about it, people were interested in it. And at the end of the day, that means essentially it had a big impact. It got to a lot of people who saw, here are the findings of a peer-reviewed paper, and in theory, this is science. This is what you can take to the bank and believe and apply. So when you look at the alt metrics, the details here say this paper was in the top 5% of all research outputs scored by this alt metric system. So of all research, we're talking about top 5 percentile. It says this is one of the highest scoring outputs from this source. It says this had a high attention score compared to outputs of the same age, put it in the 99th percentile, basically meaning among newer studies, this thing really caught fire and went pretty viral. And so it was mentioned by 193 news outlets, and, you know, all down the list. This got a lot of attention and was shared widely. And I don't care about the clicks. I care about the message, right? This paper was shared broadly as scientific evidence for what you ought to do. And the reason that I bring up those numbers is I've written, previously I wrote a mass article where I basically said that retractions aren't enough. Basically, retractions don't work in the way we hope for them to work. And basically what I meant by that was, you know, there's all these papers. I think I was writing specifically in the context of a really widely read paper about, it was about ice baths, right? And so there's this paper about ice baths. It got spread all over and people were reading it like crazy. It was wildly popular and eventually got retracted because it was rubbish. But it got retracted after it reached like millions and millions and millions of people. I think at one point I tabulated that the results were out there, conveyed as scientific truth to, I think I estimated about 5-6 million people. And so then you publish this little retraction notice and like 15,000 people hear about it. And so it's like, well, 6 million people heard this was true. And then 15,000 said, actually, a year later, never mind, forget about all that. There are so many people impacted by these findings who hear them, accept them as true. They're not like chronically online. And even if they are, they're not chronically tapped into, the British Medical Journal family of journals. And so the reality is when a study like this gets published and it goes viral and it gets shared and people talk about it on podcasts and people write articles about it, that message gets out to people, and the retraction message statistically just doesn't. It doesn't get out to people. And therefore the impact of saying, oh, well, don't worry about it. If we mess up, we'll just retract it. That's not good enough. It simply does not actually do what we need it to do, which is go out and reach the people who were misled by this work, whether intentional or unintentional, doesn't really matter. We need to convey the message to people that, hey, this is not actually a representation of what we know scientifically on the topic. And that is a huge issue that is really hard to rectify. It's really difficult to address, what are we going to ultimately do about that? How do we have a paper like this that is like super viral and reaches all these people? What is the mechanism we have to actually reach out and correct the record and give people a better understanding of what actually is true and what actually they should be doing in terms of their health, their fitness, their nutrition, whatever. And right now, I think that the reason that it's important to highlight the timeline and the procedure is like ultimately at the end of the day, this just doesn't work very well as a system. It takes way too long. It should not take the better part of 2 years to rectify something that, as we talked about in our timeline, it took a matter of days to say, hey, this stuff doesn't add up. And so if you want to actually try to get corrected information out there, even though you noticed it in a couple days, put together your a very robust, airtight justification, which ends up being more than vindicated on a statistical review, you need to, under the current system, settle in for what is essentially going to be about 2 years. It's going to take about 100 emails. It's going to be sometimes tense back and forth. Sometimes researchers won't answer you at all, which is actually a reasonably pleasant way it could go. Sometimes they get very defensive, and there have been notable situations in the past, not in this paper, where people start getting litigious, threatening to sue you for poking around, or a variety of just unpleasant things you have to deal with. Sometimes the journals will act like they're going to charge you $2 or $3 grand to have the privilege of helping them correct the record. So it's just overall a really, really bad system. And I don't bring this up just to complain, although it may be warranted in this case. But I bring this up because it brings me to a few conclusions that I think are worth addressing to the iron culture audience, who, by and large, I think views itself as being science-based or evidence-based. First and foremost, a conclusion to walk home, to take away or to take home from this whole saga is, turns out apple cider vinegar does not work better than Ozempic. It does not increase energy expenditure more than DNP. Who knew? Who knew? But it turns out that that's not the case. Another conclusion that I think should be an absolute travesty and a scandal is that this whole saga that I just explained is actually an example of the system working. So I'm sure James won't mind me sharing this, but James is tapped into that world of people who kind of do this and kind of shine a light on research that they believe may be potentially unreliable, and then investigations follow up, and sometimes there's retractions and things of that nature. And believe it or not, as tedious and protracted and annoying as that whole process sounded, this is actually a smooth and fairly expeditious run through the process. In many cases, this process will take way longer. The people who are just trying to get the scientific record corrected often end up getting in situations where people threaten to sue them or actually sue them. And so, as crazy as it sounds, this process, if you had no context for it, you would look at it and say, well, that was a mess and took way too long and was way too hard on the people who were just trying to flag research that was clearly unreliable and proved to be unreliable. But at the end of the day, that went well relative to the norm, which is a problem for not just for researchers, but for people who use research, because who knows how many papers in the next 600 days are going to get retracted that are currently being believed and put into practice, put into application. Another conclusion that's really important to highlight is this is going to get a lot worse, I think. I am not making any claim about why there's a massive degree of disagreement between the data spreadsheet and the tables in the paper that we've talked about up to this point. I don't know how that came to be, and therefore I won't comment on how that came to be. But I will say this, getting away from that paper and getting into the broader context, okay, I want to be very clear about that. It has never been easier with AI tools to just generate a fake data set that doesn't look quite as silly as what people may have done in the past. If a person wanted to fabricate a data set, they could do that using AI tools in a way that is not, at this point, I don't think it would be foolproof, but it would be a lot more convincing than in the past. Now, people who actually know how to use numbers and stuff could actually, even without AI tools, they could be up to far more malicious things in a much more convincing way. But even people who aren't that good with numbers, I think if they felt inclined to fabricate a data set or embellish a data set, I think that's easier than it's ever been. And on top of that, it's easier than it's ever been to very quickly generate a paper, using large language models. And then, you get reviews in from the peer reviewers, and it's never been easier or quicker to quickly generate a response to those reviewers using large language models. So what I'm getting at is clearly we've never been good as a world of publishing scientists at actually doing this or trying to stay on top of doing it in a prompt or expeditious way. But in a system that is likely to get flooded with a much higher number of total submissions and by extension, unreliable submissions in the years that follow, I expect that this is going to get a lot worse and a lot harder to ultimately correct or police. So yeah, I'm very concerned about just the sheer volume of kind of flooding a system that already seems to be working at a rate and with a success rate that seems to indicate that it's already not doing so well. I think flooding it with more papers more quickly is just going to stress and severely challenge an already very challenged system. So now getting into stuff that's actually practical here. What do we do with this? Why does this matter? When we say that we're going to be evidence-based or science-based as it pertains to our training, our exercise, our nutrition, our health, whatever, when you say I'm evidence-based or I'm science-based, at the end of the day, that is really a declaration of your perspective. That's a statement of epistemology, meaning I am declaring what kind of evidence I find to be valuable, what kind of evidence I find to be useful. I'm implying a certain hierarchy of different types of evidence and how I wish to apply them. I am signaling and declaring that I think the scientific method is a good idea. I think that objective scientific research is generally a good way to learn as much as we can about the world around us and what we observe in this world. So that's pretty much what you're saying. It is not saying once something hits PubMed, I'm locked in. Whether I like it or not, whether I agree with it or not, whether I think it's reliable or valid or not, once it hits PubMed, it is officially science and I am bound to it. That is not what being evidence-based is. And frankly, that is a very poor approach to trying to be evidence-based or science-based. In reality, a person who is evidence-based realizes that once a paper hits PubMed, once a paper hits that journal's website, that is where the actual evaluation and implementation of evidence begins, not where it ends. Okay, so I know this has been said a million times, so I won't belabor the point, but being evidence-based or being science-based does not mean I am forever required to have a PubMed link to justify everything I do. Someone who's evidence-based as it pertains to nutrition or training is someone who says, I have my own experiences and those are valuable. I have an understanding of broad recommendations and guidelines that are widely accepted by authorities in the space. That is also a source of information. And aside from those, also the experiences of people who have accomplished a lot in the endeavors that I'm interested in. That is also valuable information. And in addition, peer-reviewed, well-controlled scientific studies are a very, very good source of information as well. And evidence-based practice is combining all of those things. But what's really important is that for every type of information you wish to combine into your evidence-based practice or your science-based practice, there needs to be a level of evaluation that happens before it's all entered into this big mixing bowl of information we're going to act upon. So what that means is, with your own observations and anecdotes, you should be constantly challenging yourself on those. A good example is when I was in college. I remember my freshman year, I started taking an herbal dietary supplement that was marketed for muscle growth, and I really believed in it because the marketing was good. And I was a more trusting person at that stage in my life and a much more optimistic person as well. So I started taking this herbal supplement and I grew like a weed. I got very big, very strong, very quickly. And I had convinced myself very strongly, man, this supplement is incredible. I can't believe the gains that it is giving me. In hindsight, and I've recognized this shortly after this kind of honeymoon period, believing that the supplement was just incredible. I looked back at it and I said, you know what? I'm a freshman in college. I have never had this level. I lived like 100 yards from my gym, if that. It was open all the time. There was even a gym in the dorm basement that was, I don't think the university knew it existed. So it was unofficially open 24 hours a day, and you can just go in there, and it was actually like reasonably well equipped. So all that is to say, I had never enjoyed this unfettered level of access to really solid training opportunities. I never had this much free time because I probably should have been going to more classes than I was. I also was on a meal plan, so I was steps away from a dining facility, which was all you can eat. And honestly, if you've followed my content in any capacity, you know that I am not a food snob. So I was in heaven. Like all the food, as far as I could tell, was incredible. So in hindsight, I look back and I said, was it really the supplement? Or is it possible that you just really like lifting all day, sometimes multiple times a day, and eating unlimited amounts of reasonably high quality food? Could also that have had something to do with these gains you were making? So all that is to say, when you're leaning on your own experiences and your anecdotes, you still have to really challenge and interrogate those before you kind of put those in the mix in terms of dictating decision making. And we see this all the time as well when people are trying out different programs and they convince themselves, this program works for me, this one doesn't, therefore I guess I only respond to low volume stuff, or I only respond to high volume stuff. You start digging deeper And in many cases, you'll challenge the initial assumptions that you make as you're kind of making these preliminary observations. Same thing goes when we're incorporating anecdotes from other people. If our personal anecdotes sometimes end up being unreliable, then certainly we have to question anecdotes from people for whom they're talking about observations, experiences that we didn't even see with our own eyes, right? So, of course, we need to take those anecdotes and observations with a grain of salt, because we could not possibly have the whole story when someone is kind of walking us through it. We don't know if they say, oh, I did this program, I had the best gains ever. We don't really know what their diet was like day to day, their stress levels. Was it just this incredible opportunity, like I was talking about, to have low stress, low work obligations, just training all day, eating all day. Who knows if they were using other things to supplement their gains. So other people's anecdotes we have to obviously scrutinize very carefully. Expert consensus is usually measured, but it oftentimes represents a pretty good snapshot of where the evidence is at a given point in time. But those types of consensus statements and papers are certainly not infallible. Sometimes they will be led by people who have a lot of sway on the final report or the final publication, and they may have some kind of pet theories that get treated with an inappropriate lack of scrutiny, and so you will see some unreliable things sneak in from time to time, and then of course those things tend to expire at the end of the day. Sometimes years pass, we learn more about the topic, and ultimately things that were believed to be true are either severely updated or in some cases even overturned, depending on where the research leads. So all these sources of information require a great deal of scrutiny and skepticism. And at the end of the day, published, peer-reviewed scientific research is no different. Now, obviously, I live a life of science. I'm in the lab every morning dealing with my urine samples, getting the machine going for the day for our doubly labeled water analysis. I publish frequently in scientific journals, so I don't want to give the impression that I have become some kind of cynical, nihilistic person who believes that there's no point to all this. If that were the case, I would probably be having a severe identity crisis or I wouldn't say a midlife crisis, but I also wouldn't say a quarter life crisis. So a third life crisis, maybe. I'd be going through it if that was really where I was at mentally. That's not where I'm at mentally. However, I do have a high level of concern that a lot of stuff's getting published that shouldn't. And when the process of rectifying that takes 600 days and maybe a couple $1,000 and maybe 100 emails, and you're treated like a nuisance the whole time you're doing it, which dissuades you from doing it in the future, it's a very thankless thing. It's a very inefficient process. I'm very concerned that if we continue as scientists to pretend that that system is adequate, we're going to continue to publish first and ask questions later. We're going to continue to publish unreliable information. That unreliable information is going to reach way more people than the eventual retraction notice. And ultimately, we will be contributing as scientists to a system where people will start to correctly take note of the fact that, I guess now with published science, I'll say now, even though it's always been true, but you have to take it with a big grain of salt. Now, that's always going to be true, but I think now more than ever as a scientific community, we have to be really cautious about how hard we're working to earn and preserve the trust of the non-scientific community, So I have concerns about that. And then when it comes specifically to the fitness space, I just think it's really critical that we have to be very, very skeptical of research that gets published. We have to scrutinize it very carefully. It's okay to really dig into the research, reach out to multiple content creators in the space that you trust and say, hey, this seems weird to me. What do you think? This seems odd to me. What do you think? These two papers seem like they are fully contradictory. What do I make of this? At the end of the day, I think that dialogue is going to be really critical. If we want to have like a metaphorically healthy, robust, science-based or evidence-based lifting community that's using research to inform our training and our nutrition. Unfortunately, we cannot rely on the journals themselves to play defense against some of these unreliable papers and prevent them from getting published. We need to have what is often called kind of secondary or post-publication peer review happening within the lifting community. We have to have chatter and discussion and debate. And sometimes that debate may get animated, may get tense, depending on, people have their pet theories. This paper supports it, that paper rejects it. People get into some heated debates over this stuff. And of course, we should be able to do it in a very measured, reasonable way. But that more than ever, I think that debate, disagreement, conversation, that is really critical for making sure that the evidence is ultimately bolstering what we're trying to do with our training and nutrition rather than hindering it or getting in the way. So we look to research for increased clarity more so than we look to it for confusion. And I think sometimes confusion is an intermediate step we have to take. Sometimes research findings at first don't make sense. Then we replicate them and replicate them and replicate them, and we realize, oh, we had it all wrong from the start. So we shouldn't be quick to outright refute everything that initially doesn't really make a ton of sense. But we have to remember to kind of keep those good practices in mind, which is one paper or a couple papers with, some indicators that they could be unreliable, could be shady. Those things come out. We don't need to immediately rush to application. Sometimes we do have to remember to slow our horses a little bit, to kind of take a slow, measured approach and say, let's wait to see if this actually gets replicated. Let's try to make sense of this in the context of other literature. And sometimes being the slow one to move ultimately pays off, because you don't end up chasing these random things that prove to be unreliable. So just within the last couple of years, I've kind of written pretty extensively about these two papers that have been ultimately retracted. One of them was on ice baths. The other was on apple cider vinegar. Now, what is the probability of absolute tragedy if you took those papers at face value? At the end of the day, pretty low probability, right? There have been rare but very severe adverse effects associated with some people doing ice baths that really shouldn't have been. They were not in the cardiovascular condition to do it, or they were doing it dangerously out in water that was too deep. And you'll see rare instances where people will have cardiac events or accidental drownings from certain approaches to cold water, like ice baths or cold water immersion. But by and large, usually the downside of doing cold water immersion is that you wasted 15 minutes of extreme discomfort for no tangible output, which is annoying, but again, not a tragedy. With apple cider vinegar, maybe you had to take a shot for a while of something that you didn't really enjoy. And if you're taking it as a shot, non-diluted, maybe you did, a modest level of negative, a modest level of harm to your tooth enamel because of how extremely acidic it is. But again, we're not talking about outright tragedies here. But I think the real downside of, especially with these kind of hot topic papers that keep getting published and then retracted, is at a certain point, we're going to lose, as a scientific community, the trust of people. And at a certain point, it's like, well, if we keep doing this, do we deserve it in the first place? And the answer is probably no. So that's why, not to like turn this into some kind of advertisement, but that's why, we, the folks at the Mass Research Review and many research reviews like us, we find it so important to, and it's the reason we do this podcasting. It's the reason we do research reviews is, unfortunately, relying on the journals to do their own business and do their work effectively. It's not the best approach these days unless you're willing to be wrong for a couple years and then say, oh, okay, never mind. So I want to extend this as a challenge to the science-based or evidence-based lifting community. Talk. You already do, but keep it up. Talk early, talk often, talk regularly, with zeal when it comes to new research that comes out. It is important that we kind of work as a whole community to stress test these new findings that catch our attention, approach them with open-mindedness, but also with skepticism and scrutiny, have those conversations about what we think we can or cannot take away from this research, and ultimately, put out a variety of perspectives about where the research currently stands, which papers seem to be reliable and which ones seem not to be. That's not to make it some kind of huge witch hunt where every paper is presumed to be, guilty until proven innocent with this, extreme level of skepticism. But we got to keep our eyes open, and we got to, whenever a new paper comes out, if it absolutely stuns us, those are important conversations to have because, one of the things I'm really happy about, one of the things I'm not going to lie, I'm really proud about it is with that ice bath paper and with this paper, people near me were not taking it seriously. And they saved themselves the trouble and the confusion about a year or two before there was any kind of indication coming back from the journals. What frustrates me is that even with our best efforts, we know that, like I said, with the ice bath paper, that reached 6 million people, and I'm not reaching 6 million people to remind them, hey, actually, that wasn't legit. With the apple cider vinegar paper, again, we can look at those altmetric scores and say, okay, we saw 193 news outlets shared the original paper. Are we going to have 193 that share the retraction notice? Of course not. We'd be lucky to get to 30, I think. I'd love to be wrong about that, but I've seen a handful, and these kinds of, a retraction notice does not have a long tail in terms of the news picking it up. Basically, you get a little flash in the pan, and it's probably going to dry up pretty soon here. So if I had to guess, by the time it's all said and done, the ratio of news outlets to cover it versus the original paper versus news outlets to cover the retraction notice, it'll probably end up being like 193 to 25-ish. And usually the news outlets that cover the retractions are not, they're not the ones that people actually, they're not the ones that have massive readership. You get the really big, the really big kind of lay press sites that will say, hey, apple cider vinegar to lose 15 pounds in 12 weeks. But then it's like some blog that's dedicated to science literacy and statistics that'll eventually cover the retraction. And what they do is very important work, and they do it, a lot of those outlets do it quite well, but their readership is 100,000th of what you get in some of the lay press outlets that will cover the flashy news story when it appears to work, but they never really quite get around to putting out a new article saying, by the way, never mind, forget all that. So briefly, I'm going to check in on the chat here. So like I said earlier, my mistake, my personal apology to the Iron Cult. I will bring back the jazz music. It will be, I don't know if it'll be for next episode, but it will be coming. Bear with me, folks. C chimed in, first of all, with the comment, flaky Helms. I don't know any other way to put it. This is a flaky man. He cannot be relied upon, but we do wish him well in whatever he's up to as he skips yet another episode of Iron Culture. Another comment here from C says, I just lost 20 pounds the hard way. If only it were this easy. So, yeah, I mean, it would be great if, again, instead of spending $500 or $1,000 on Ozempic and, running the risk of the low probability, but, substantive adverse effects that could occur. Yeah, a shot of apple cider vinegar sounds pretty good compared to that, but unfortunately doesn't work out. Question was, where did apple cider vinegar get such a cult following to begin with? That I honestly do not know. All I know is it's been bouncing around the kind of fitness wellness world for quite some time. I do believe that it varies regionally. There are some regions of the world where it has a lot more cultural purchase than others. But in any case, it is big. And once something kind of gets that reputation for being this kind of like wellness oriented remedy, for lack of a better term, it really takes a long time for that to go away. So I think apple cider vinegar is going to be around for a while. I wouldn't bother using it for any outcome really, but I don't expect it to go quietly into the night just because this one paper was retracted. Got a comment about AI paper mills. Yeah, paper mills have always been a thing. These are basically entities, small collections of people who kind of just churn out these academic papers that are very low quality, sometimes nonsensical, but they just kind of churn them out and get them submitted to journals and just try to push them through the publication process. You might be wondering why, but there's all sorts of weird incentive processes or incentive structures that would lead one to pursue that process. But back in the day, if you were going to do a paper mill, someone had to actually sit down and write the thing. Even though it was rubbish mostly, they still had to do it. But like I was saying with my concerns, it seems that it's never been easier to run a paper mill, that's for sure. And frankly, you probably don't even need as much of a paper mill these days if your whole goal was to just get something out the door. With AI tools, it's never been easier, and I do fear the short-term impact that'll have on journals. Now, and not just journals, but the scientific literature is really what I care about. Having said that, some optimism. Theoretically, these journal publishing companies who are worth very large amounts of money should be able to find creative ways to leverage AI tools for the good of the journal's rigor and processes. So I certainly wouldn't discount that, but I definitely think it's a game of cat and mouse. And I think the mouse is winning right now relative to the cat. And I hope that the cat, in this metaphor, the publishing companies, the journal publishers, I hope that they will, catch up in a meaningful way. And I do believe that there is promise for those tools to be developed, but they're probably already developed. They need to be implemented at scale in a way that's actually useful and effective. Another comment here, or question I should say, how are the incentives about doing replications versus novel research structured in academia? It's getting better, but it's still there's much more fanfare and prestige and therefore incentive to publish totally novel original research more so than trying to replicate something that has been found previously. I think that compared to all other times in human history, it's never been more appreciated to do replication research, but we still certainly have not gotten to the point where that is viewed as, an equal contribution to the literature by any means. And that's ultimately a problem. If we are of the belief that the value of science is adding knowledge, improving the knowledge base of the published literature, in theory, we would incentivize this kind of work of identifying papers that warrant retraction. In theory, removing an unreliable paper from the literature, I think, should be just as valuable as adding a new reliable paper to the literature. Replicating a finding should be viewed as just as valuable as an original finding. At the end of the day, they're all going to be little data points on a meta-analysis, and frankly, when you look at that forest plot or that funnel plot, once the meta-analysis is done in 20 years, you're never really going to look at it and say, yeah, but who came out first? And so I think we are broadly adopting that perspective of, really embracing meta science and looking at the big picture rather than, the whole idea that it was so much more valuable to publish something novel. I think that ultimately comes down to like this old school view of the career of a scientist or academic more so than what is good for learning and the literature itself. So, for example, you could really make a name for yourself by identifying, the Trexler theory of blank with this novel finding, the first to do it. And of course, it's valuable to have people seeking to be innovative and to learn new things about the world, but the idea that being the first to the punch is necessarily advantageous or good or valuable, that is, from my view, exclusively a career / ego oriented perspective of I want to be the first because then it's my discovery. Whereas if the main concern really was just making sure that we had robust scientific literature to lean on, the first to find it is no more valuable than the third to find it. And frankly, not until we have the second, third, and fourth to find it would we actually want to really hang our hat on that set of observations. So I think that we are broadly, slowly moving away from that model of, everyone trying to be the first to something. I think we're understanding the value more as a collective scientific community of, I think we're more appreciating the value of replication. And so we still have a lot of work to do in terms of rectifying some of those incentive structures, but they're definitely, to be optimistic, they're definitely moving in the right direction for sure. So great comments and questions in the chat over there in the Iron Culture chat. I want to make sure that I'm answering both chats. So let me pop in here. Yeah, I think I got to everything that I could see. So hopefully people in both chats feel adequately listened to, that they've gotten adequate attention during this live recording of the Iron Culture podcast. I'm just going to zoom out real quick. Yeah. So everyone, I want to thank you once again, as my light turns off, for joining in on a live recording of Iron Culture. I really appreciate all the comments, all the questions, all the support as always. Once again, if you like the show and you want to do what you can to support, many ways to do it. Make sure that you like, rate, subscribe, review. Make sure you go over to massresearchreview.com and consider becoming a member of the Mass community. Definitely make sure that you're supporting our dear, dear friends over at Elite FTS. Fantastic folks over there. Like I said, I've been using their products for well over a decade. And finally, as I was killing time and saying the things that are burned into my memory, I navigated over to the other live chat. So I just want to make a quick, I want to quickly address some of the comments over there. I did the Mass live chat. Now I'm in the Iron Culture live chat. So Dylan said, Helms is going to be here to show his commitment to the cult, right? And the answer is no. As we've already seen, regrettably, I don't know what his commitments are to, but it's definitely not the cult. Got a lovely good night message from Eduardo. Good night. Sleep well. Appreciate you popping into the chat. Steven says it's Dr. Trexler versus Big Vinegar. Absolutely it is. It is frightening to go up against a massive industry like this. We know that they have unlimited power, unlimited wealth. They could make a person like me go away very easily, but I'm willing to take on the vinegar lobby and the vinegar mafia, so to speak. So we'll see how it goes. But if anything negative were to happen to me, certainly the vinegar barons are the culprits for sure. And then Dylan said, it's really sad. My nutrition professor is an RD and once stated in our class, taking apple cider vinegar is one of the healthiest things you can do. Yikes, Dylan. Yikes. I am going to be charitable and pretend that there is some kind of context that I'm not understanding in which that would be a defensible thing to say. But my initial reaction is, yikes, Dylan. Yeah, so if you were going to talk about what are some of the healthiest things you could do to wrap up the show here, apple cider vinegar, I don't believe it would make my top 1,000 healthiest things to do. Number one is be physically active. Number two is eat a balanced diet with adequate macro and micronutrition. Certainly things on the short list would be avoid smoking. If you're going to drink alcohol, do it in moderation. Get adequate sleep. Develop and maintain close social bonds and a good social network in your local community. identify something that gives your day and, in more broader terms, your life a great sense of purpose, such that you feel connected to things bigger than yourself. We could go on a very long list before we ever got to apple cider vinegar. So that is very, very troubling. And Dylan has challenged me in the 11th hour of the show, metaphorically, to do my whole top 1,000. So I tell you what, Dylan, stay tuned. So the next issue of Mass is coming out in a couple days, October 1st. November or December 1st, make sure you tune in to see if I've decided to list as an article in Mass my top 1,000 things to do for your health. I'm not committing to it. I'm certainly not guaranteeing it. But if it keeps you on the edge of your seat, Dylan, you can think about the possibility of me listing out 1,000 healthy things, and we can take bets on whether or not apple cider vinegar will show up somewhere in the 980 to 1,000 range. Time will tell. All right, folks. As always, thanks so much for joining me. Really appreciate you checking in. We will be back with another episode in 7 days. But until then, everyone have a fantastic week and take care of yourself.